Loveland, Colorado. My name is Brad Hoops. I'm the interviewer for the Northern Colorado Veterans History Project. Welcome, Pastor Johnson, and thank you for participating in the project today.
Thank you.
Let's start out, if we could. Tell us a little bit about yourself, your date of birth, where you were born, a little bit about your family.
I was born on May 12th, 1924, at Bothell, Washington.
I'm sorry, where in Washington?
Bothell, Washington, just outside of Seattle. My father was there working as a construction worker. But then we moved back to Minnesota, where I grew up, at about 60 miles west of Minneapolis.
And what town was that?
Paynesville.
Paynesville?
Paynesville, Minnesota. So that's where I went to rural school, and my mother died when I was 2.5 years old, so I lived with my grandparents, and I went to finished high school at Paynesville. So that's we grew up on a lake, so we had I was either in the lake or on the lake most of the time as a kid. So I grew up in a kind of a retirement community. There were small farms which people retired to, and my father continued construction, but was home very little. When I was 11 years old, he remarried, got a wonderful stepmother, and I have two siblings, half-brother and half-sister. So then when I finished high school, I had the opportunity to go with a cousin of mine to California, and went to work for Lockheed Aircraft.
Now, when you left for California, had the war already broken out?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, this was in 1942.
Okay. Do you remember where you were when you heard that Pearl Harbor had been bombed and what you were thinking?
Yes, I remember very well. We were sitting at the breakfast table on December 7th, and we always listened to the news in the morning, and we were all shocked, of course, and I knew immediately I was a senior in high school, so I knew that probably I would be involved in a military operation of some kind that day. But first of all, there was very little employment in our area, so I had this opportunity to go to California.
So Pearl Harbor happened in December. You graduated in that following spring from high school,
Yes,
and
right.
then right from there went out to California.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And worked in the Lockheed factory.
Yeah, Lockheed.
Now, did that give you a deferment from the military then?
Well, I could have gotten a deferment, but my father said to me, he said, I think you would be wise not to get a deferment, because he said he got a deferment when World War I, and it was always a stigma on his life because of that. So he said, I think you should be in the military. So I finally got the papers, and I went to the supervisor, and he said, well, we'd get a deferment for you. And I said, no, I don't want a deferment. I want to go. So anyway, they assured me that when I got out of the military, I would have a job, with Lockheed. But it was a very interesting time. We were working on the P-38, and I'm amazed as I look back that they entrusted me with a job of finalizing the installation of the cooling system on the P-38. So I would at least finish one plane a day, and then I would sell that to the Army or the Air Corps, because the way they sold the plane was by components. So I would finish that. So we got to the point where sometimes we were doing 2 planes a day.
That's an amazing responsibility for an 18-year-old.
Yes,
Yeah.
right. And as I look back, I'm really amazed that they had trusted that job to me. But of course, I had training and instruction on how to do those kind of things. One funny thing I remember, I had coming from Minnesota, I never had experience with an earthquake. So one day I had finished my job and I was helping a man out on the wing of the P-38. And all of a sudden the wing went clear down the floor. And I thought, I'd never tipped a plane before. And then I looked down the assembly line and they were all going, back and forth. So I went from, I had a menial job back in Minnesota for $15 a week, and I went from there to 90 cents an hour and then getting overtime and so on. So it was quite a difference. And then we rented an apartment for $28 a month. And it was the whole different, culture and background and so on.
Right.
So,
So from there then, you went off and enlisted, or were you drafted?
no, I was drafted. So when I got to the induction center, they told me that wanted to know my background and so on. So I told them about Lockheed, and they said, well, we need mechanics in Tunisia. And if you're willing to go, we'll give you a staff sergeant rating and you won't have to go to boot camp. So they went to check and then they came back and said the quota was filled. So they said, what branch of service would you like to be in? So I said, I prefer the Navy, I said, because I grew up on the water, I like the sea, I like those kind of things. So then I got assigned to, they signed me up at the Navy and was shipped to San Diego for boot camp. During my time in California, I started drinking pretty heavy. So it was a salvation for me in that sense that I got away from the alcohol. I had lost a lot of weight because I was not eating right and so on. So anyway, we went to boot camp. My initial experience was to have my head shaved and so on. But we had a wonderful commander who was training, and our final day of training was interesting. We had a 30-mile hike with rifles and full packs. And then we came back and we thought, now we'll go and shower and get ready for chow. No, they said we're going to do calisthenics. So we did calisthenics for an hour. And we thought, well, we're through. But then they said we had to run the obstacle course. So it was interesting how our bodies had really toughened in and so on. So then I had about 3 or 4 day leave, and I went back up to Hollywood where I had lived and visited with some friends. And then when I got back, they shipped us up to, I can't remember the name of the place, but up near San Francisco, where we were preparing to deploy for overseas. We were there for about 2 weeks, I think, waiting for it. Finally, we got, our whole company was shipped overseas. I'll never forget leaving the harbor. We had, for some reason, we had about some boxcars, railroad boxcars. And our ship began to zigzag because one ship had been torpedoed by the Japanese off the coast.
Off the coast of the United States?
Yes.
Oh, is that right? Oh, wow.
So our ship began to zigzag, and I realized, it began to dawn on me that this is serious business. I got up behind one of those cars and I sat down. I grew up in church, and I sat down and I had a little talk with the Lord. I said, if you bring me back to safe, I'll give you the rest of my life for service in the kingdom. So we had a good trip. I can't remember, probably 4 or 5 days.
Did you have at that point have any idea where you were going? They probably hadn't
No,
told you where you were
no,
going.
we
Yeah.
had no idea. So we arrived in Pearl Harbor, and then we were all sent to submarine base for deployment. The first day we were there, we were assigned to clean the underside of the submarine. And I thought, this is not for me. So the next day, when we gathered for the early morning meeting, they asked if somebody was in the group was able to type. I'd taken typing in high school. So I hesitated, but finally I said, yeah. I said, I know how to type. So 2 of us were assigned to the submarine base. The rest of our company was shipped out to various places. That was the end of our relationship as a company. I was assigned to personnel office. So my duties were varied in the personnel office, taking care of various records. We had 10,000 men on the submarine base. And in those days, we didn't have computers.
Right.
Everybody was on a little card. So sometimes people would come and ask, this Joe, whatever. I got so that I could tell you whether that person was without looking at the file. But you work with those cards every day,
Yeah.
so your mind gets up. So during that time, I established a good relationship with my superiors, the officers. Then something happened in which a friend of mine by the name of Loyd Johnson was stationed at Hickam Field. His mother was a distant relative of mine. And so he came over one day and he said, we were surprised. We didn't know we were there.
Uh-huh.
It was a surprise. So he said, do you know that so-and-so is here on the base? And I said, no. And there was another neighbor of ours. So anyway, the 3 of us got together, and we had some time. Sometimes we would have leave and so on. And then he invited me to go to church with him. And the church was quite different from anything that I had grown up with, but I finally had a meeting with the pastor one day, and I had some questions, and he was able to answer my questions, which I had never found anybody that could do. And because of that, my whole life was changed. So, because of my physical makeup and so on, I was a fighter, right? I mean, nobody messed with me. But after this spiritual experience of receiving Christ in my life has changed. And the men occasionally would come to me. Out of the 27 men we had in the office, they all came to me at some time or another and said, what's happened to your life? But they began to become very uncomfortable with me. Not because I was preaching to them or anything, but they said, we're gonna get rid of you in one way or another. So an opportunity opened up, thanks to my superior, to become the secretary to the man who had charge of all the torpedoes in the Pacific Fleet, Commander Tiedemann. So my superior said, I recommend that you take this job, but first we'll have to clear you for top secret position. So I was cleared. My folks later said, why was the FBI all over the place, questioning everybody about you? So that became a very interesting, so when the submarines would come in, they would turn in their logs to our department. I was the only enlisted man in an office of 3 officers and myself. So then when the commander had gone through the records, the logbooks, he would turn them over to me to do various things, write letters or record certain things and so on. Commander Tiedemann was a wonderful man, and we had a good relationship. And I was in that office for a year. I think of a couple of incidents in that time which were very interesting. One day, a group of admirals had a meeting in our office. Admiral Nimitz and Halsey, some of those. And their discussion was over how we got into war with Japan. It was very interesting.
Wow.
They felt that there was information, that the President Roosevelt had information, what was going on, but none of the naval officers were informed. So Admiral Short got court-martialed over this thing, and some other high-ranking officers.
Over the Pearl Harbor bombing?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. They were scapegoats, and these admirals were not happy about that.
Wow.
So that was a very key, and a lot of my communication was with admirals. And everywhere I went, I had to report to FBI that I was where I was leaving, because in that office, I knew where the next battles were going to be. I knew all those plans. So it was, but I never was really afraid, because I knew the FBI was probably not very far away from me. The other thing, humorous thing, was that we had a lieutenant commander in our office who was the assistant. And 4:30 in the afternoon, he'd say, well, let's go get drunk. So every night he'd get drunk. Well, I wound up having to work sometimes 12, 14, 16 hours, because after the officers left, I had all this clerical stuff to finish up.
Yeah, at this point, you'd given up drinking and...
Yes.
Yeah, okay,
Oh, yeah.
okay. Uh-huh.
And then Saturday afternoon, quite often, let me finish that story.
Sorry.
So then he'd usually show up back in the office about 9:30, 10 o'clock. He'd say, Loyd, let's sing some hymns. He was a character. One day they called our office and said there was a Japanese landmine that had come ashore on the other side of the island. So they asked if the lieutenant commander would go over and blow it up. So he took our driver and a couple of other guys and went over and he took a rifle along and shot the detonator. But he was quite a character. But anyway, and then what was interesting was that I had some friends that were on submarines, and they would come in and talk to me about their tour duty. Two that I remember particularly, three things I would say, is that they made contact with a officer who was in the Philippines, who was hiding out in the jungle. And so one of our submarines went in and made contact with him and took him aboard for a few days and introduced him to some new radio equipment. Put him ashore again, and he was there. The second thing was that one of our submarine commanders was was outside of Tokyo Harbor, and he saw an opportunity to go into Tokyo Harbor.
Wow.
He followed the ship into the harbor, and when he got in the harbor, he raised the submarine where he could get the periscope above the water. And he discovered that they were about ready to launch an aircraft carrier. So he laid on the bottom of Tokyo Harbor for 2 weeks, waiting for the launching of this aircraft carrier. So the day came and he had a full load of torpedoes. So when they launched that aircraft carrier, he let loose with several torpedoes and blew up that aircraft carrier.
Wow.
Right off the launching pad. And then he turned and torpedoed a number of other ships with what he had left. Then there was chaos in the harbor, so he got in right behind one of the ships that was leaving because they had a net in the entrance of the harbor. And lo and behold, he got out. I met this commander. He almost got court-martialed because he had taken excessive steps of danger, endangered his steward. So. But it's quite a story, and I think they made a movie of that incident. The next thing was one night a friend of mine came in. He said, "I am going out, leaving at midnight on a ship." He was a Christian young man. He said to me, "The Lord has said to me, our sub is going to go down in this trip." And the rule was that they could get off. You know, they didn't have to go. Well, submarine service was volunteer. So I said, "Well, why don't you get off?" He said, "I'm the only Christian on that boat." He said, "If we get sunk and we are at the bottom," he said, "these men will need to know God, and I want to give my life for that." And I went down to the slit where his submarine was, and I stood there and watched it as it pulled away. And he was standing on the deck, and he waved to me. That was the last I saw him. And 2 weeks later, I heard the submarine had been sunk. But that young man gave his life for the rest of them. The other thing was that while I was there, the submarine base, in September of 44 was scheduled for invasion of Okinawa. We had a lot of ships in the harbor, so we had made a flotilla of ships, 2 big ammunition ships, surrounded by 5 tankers, destroyers, and all in a flotilla.
That must have been an incredible sight to see.
So we don't know exactly what happened, but the word that I got from being in the office in the position I was in was that they think it was either a one-man Japanese submarine or a frogman that got up and blew up the one ammunition ship. And this all happened on a Sunday too. And so that blew up the second one and blew up the 5 tankers. And all of that oil spread out over the Pearl Harbor and caught on fire. We had flames. We lost more men and ships in that incident than we did at Pearl Harbor on December 7th.
And you hear very little about it.
There's nothing I've heard about it. But when I read the history books of the Pacific War, I noticed that from September to March, when they made the invasion finally of Okinawa, there is no history of that. But I know that the invasion of Okinawa was delayed by 6 months.
Because of that?
Because of that incident. We had 10,000 extra men on our base that were sleeping in shifts, waiting for deployment for this invasion. Okinawa was terrible. We lost 12,000 men, but the Japanese lost 70,000. Those are just incidents. So finally, as you know, there were a number of military actions in the Pacific between after Okinawa, getting ready, till finally in, I think it was in August 45, that the Japanese finally surrendered.
Now, that was because we dropped the atomic bombs.
Yes.
Now, in your position, were you privy to that information? Did you know that was happening, or?
Yes, I knew. Yeah, I knew something was going on, but I didn't know anything about the bomb. But I knew about, well, we had already bombed them with an ordinary bomb.
Yes, yeah.
But I didn't know about, I knew that something was going on. I knew that Doolittle was going to lead a squadron, but I didn't know about the atomic bomb, of course.
And once that was dropped and you heard about it, could you wrap your arms around the concept of what this thing had done? And
No, I had no concept. Well, it was all new to all
Right,
of us.
right.
There was nothing we could do. The days at the submarine base was very good. The temperature in Hawaii at night was like in 65, 70, so sleeping was wonderful. Submariners were fed the best. We had steak every day. We had good things. So from the standpoint of comfort, I couldn't have found a better place to be during the war here.
now, in your sorry to interrupt, but in your position there, you said you took in the log. One of your positions was taking the log books. Was that to analyze how many torpedoes were shot? And,
Yes.
I mean, and
Yeah.
and how they were,
Yeah.
how consistent they were, or what was the whole idea to your?
So, yeah, at first our torpedoes were fueled by alcohol, and then in the time that I was there in that year, we switched to electric torpedoes. So yeah, we wanted to know what these torpedoes had, how they had functioned. It was really our main concern. And what kind of damage they were doing, how effective they were, and all, et cetera, information. So I don't remember technically how,
Sure.
what all I had to do, but we had to submit reports to other officials about
Okay.
the function of these things. And during that time, I was a second yeoman second class. But I was doing yeoman first class, and I was recommended for first class. But I never had time to take the exam. And anyway, I just wanted out. So when once the war was over with, my commander said, well, there's not much more for us to do right now because everything is standstill. So within 30 days, I was making arrangements to come back to the U.S. I had been there for 2 years, 1 year in personnel and 1 year working for this commander. I think about one humor, so I could back up just a minute.
Sure.
When I
Oh,
was
certainly.
in the personnel office, I had had no contact with the black people before. We had in those days in the military,
Very segregated.
they
Yeah.
were segregated.
Yeah.
So one day we got a letter from a black lady back in the U.S. saying that she wasn't getting her allotment payments. So I called the young man up and I said, the name that's in your record book is different from this lady. So I said, do you know this? Showed him the letter. And he said, yes, sir. Yes, sir, he said. She's my former wife. And I said, well, she still claims to be your wife. So I said, do you have divorce papers to show that? He looked at me kind of blank and he said, what's that? So I said, when you separated, didn't you go before a judge and declare that your marriage was ended? No, sir. No, sir, he said. When we parted, she went her way and I went mine. Oh, Lord. So I said, well, we better go see the attorney. So we went down to see the, but he knew black people better than I did. So he asked him, he said, well, was your first wife, was she married when you married her? And his eyes got big, he said, yes, sir. So it did two things for me. I got a little acquainted with the culture that I never got acquainted with. But anyway, I entered the service in July of '43, and I was discharged in May of '46.
46. So you stayed on almost another 6 months or so after the war ended before you were finally discharged in, huh?
Yeah, so the war was over. They signed the peace treaty, as you probably know, on September 2nd of
Mm-hmm.
45. So then I had to look for a way to get back to the States, and I had a choice of three things. Either planes, but they were flying these worn out 24s and B-17s. I knew one of them had never made it. There was a flotilla of PT boats going back. Said you could go with them. No, I want to go on a ship. So I got a troop ship headed for San Francisco. And we got in a big storm. And we were pitching at 45 feet, going down on the waves and then back up. The ship was almost standing up. We were in that storm for 3 days, with 1,500 men on board. 12 of us were all that came down to the chow hall, and I was one of them.
So seasickness wasn't an issue for you then, huh? Or,
No, I never got sick.
is that right?
I got sick. And then I found a place to sleep up on top deck, out of the whatever. So we finally arrived in San Francisco again. I was never so glad in all my life to see the Golden Gate Bridge. Thank God for answering my prayer. Then we got asked about where we wanted to be discharged. And I said, well, I'd like to go back to Minnesota and discharge there, because I said, I don't have anybody in Los Angeles area. So they they gave me a weekend pass, and I had met an officer overseas. He said, if you ever get to San Francisco, he said, look up my parents. His father was a sea captain. He was aboard a hospital ship. His name was, so I called him, and it happened so that the captain was in. So I spent a weekend with these dear people, and it was just wonderful. They're wonderful Christian people, and we had a good time. And it was good to get acquainted with this captain who had one of the few licenses to sail into any harbor in the world. He had that high a rating. So when I got back, I was getting sick. I got strep throat. So I went to sick bay, and they put me in the hospital. And it was very, it had really gotten a grip on me. So I spent 2 weeks in the hospital. Those were days when they just started using penicillins, and so they didn't know how much or, anything. I remember I got 53 shots of penicillin. When I finally got out of the hospital, I went back to where I had left my gear, and they said, well, the officer wants to see you. I went to see him, and he was a young ensign, and he said, where have you been? And he started getting smart with me. And I said, have you been overseas? He said, no, I've been overseas. I said, I just got back from 2 years overseas. And I said, I don't appreciate your attitude. He hung his head and apologized. I could have gotten court-martialed.
Yeah.
So then we got aboard a troop train going to Chicago. We had nothing but naval people on the ship. And so we went from San Francisco. I remember the beauty of going through the passes in Colorado. From Denver, we went to Cheyenne, and then Cheyenne through North Platte. And I never will forget the ladies at North Platte. They had huge tables loaded with sandwiches and cake and so on. And then we went on to Chicago, went to the naval base, the Great Lakes Naval Base. And so they said, well, would you be interested in taking a short leave? And I said, no, that'd be wonderful. I said, maybe get home just for a day, and then, because I hadn't been home for 3 years.
Right.
I'd worked and then went in the military.
How was that as far as, back in those days, people really didn't travel all that much. They kind of stayed home, close-knit families. And here you went off and were gone for 3 years. Did homesickness play into that at all? I mean, how did you deal with that at all? Or was
I did get homesick, and I went home, caught a bus, went home for a few days, because I missed my grandmother. My grandmother really was my mother, because she had raised me, and so I went home for a few days, and then I went back to California. But from then on, no. But I felt sorry for some of the young men that were in boot camp who really got homesick. I remember one man, a 17-year-old boy, he was sobbing. I sat down beside him in his bunk, and I said, what's your problem? He said, I want to see my mother. And it was tragic because the rest of our company, and I'm jumping around here.
Oh, that's fine.
The rest of our company wound up seeing 5 major battles in 6 months. And they were killed, maimed, and this young man lost his mind. I saw him in the hospital, and his mind was completely gone. I just ached for him. I was in the hospital at the time for strep throat too.
Mm.
Kind of jumping around here,
Yeah.
but while I was in the hospital, they fed me sulfa, and I had a reaction to sulfa, and they didn't expect me to live. I was in a coma when the doctor came and looked in my eyes and said to the nurse, "This man will be dead by morning." But God had a plan for my life, and I was spared. But getting back to Chicago, um, I went home for 72 hours, and my little half brother didn't know who I was. You know,
Wow.
he'd never seen me because I was just a young
Yeah, right.
kid. But everybody was glad to see me, and I was glad to see. I was glad to be in my bed, and my dog, who I had grown up with, was still alive, and he crawled into bed with me.
Oh, that must have been wonderful.
His name was Boy. He lived to be 19 years old. So I went back to Chicago, and they said, "Well, we'll get your transfer papers to go to Minneapolis." I waited and waited. I went to the office every day. No, he said, finally they said, "We can't find your records." So one day, being working in personnel, I knew how things get shuffled around. So my dad and I had a plan to go deer hunting when I got home. So I was anxious to get home, and so I walked into the office and I said, "Fellows, since you can't find my records, I'll find them." So they had these wire baskets on the desk. So I started going through them, and about the third one, I found my records.
Is that right?
I said, "Now you get my transfer ready while I go get my bag." And I said, "I'm going to Minneapolis." So when I got back, they had my transfer papers and ticket for the train. Got to the Naval Air Base, and I said, "I want a 30-day leave," and which they granted immediately. I got home for 30 days, and by now it's early part of November, as I remember. And so I had time to go hunting with my dad for a week. Then I went back after 30 days to, they had more people than what they needed, so he said, "Well, you got another 30 days coming," so he said, why don't you go home?" So I went home, and it was a good thing because my dad needed some help. He'd had a double hernia operation, so, so I did some of the farm work, and this is in the spring, 46. So then I went back and worked for a few weeks until I got my discharge papers from honorable discharge from the United States Navy. And of course, I was glad because I knew even as a boy that God's plan for my life is to be a pastor.
So you'd always felt that from an early age. That wasn't something that developed
No.
more so in the military?
Well, it developed.
Yeah.
But, when I was 8 years old, I had an unusual experience of hearing voice and knowing it was called from God. I wandered far away from God in the ensuing years, but I knew what God wanted me to do. So in the meanwhile, I had met my wife. She was attending college, Bible college in Minneapolis.
Now, this is after you got out of the military?
Yes.
Okay, okay.
No, while I was still in the military. I went there to see my cousin, and then I discovered that my wife-to-be was there. She was a student, so. And we struck up a friendship, and we were married, and later on in '46.
Now, you met her during one of your furloughs home, or how long?
No,
kind of
I
a
met her
timeline.
while I was at the military, stationed at Naval Air Base at Minneapolis.
Oh, okay.
Naval Air Base at Minneapolis. So I would go in on weekends, and we would go out and have dates.
Uh-huh.
So we married, and so that's kind of the military part of my life.
Let's move on. We'll move on to your life from the military on. But a couple questions. How was it in both directions? How was it from the transition from civilian life into military life, and then once you got out from military life back to civilian life? Were either transitions much of a transition for you, or?
I think entering the military was a real blessing for me. It was. I was fortunate to have good superiors all the way from boot camp to personnel officer, who was really wonderful, and also working for the commander. No, growing up by myself, I was rather independent. My father and I, we never got along very well because he was hardly ever home, and when he was, we did not have a good relationship.
Mm-hmm.
So really, the Navy became a home for me. I was comfortable. We had good, like I said, a good place to sleep, good food. And getting out of the military was, I debated about getting out because I was offered advancement to get my first class rating and opportunity to make a tour around the world and a number of things, but I knew what God wanted me to do.
Mm-hmm.
So
Now, with the position that you held there and all the information you knew about, were you ever, as part of your getting out of the military, were you ever taken aside by the FBI and declassified, if you will, or told anything in regards to?
The only thing I was told was that this could not be revealed for a period of time.
Okay.
But now it's all,
Sure.
Now it's all opportune time. So the privilege of going to church while I was in Hawaii was really good because I got into the culture of various Chinese, Filipinos, Japanese people. So it was an enriching experience for me to be in Honolulu. I didn't care about going ashore. I just wanted to go to church.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
We had hundreds of servicemen that went through that church during my time there. It was a joy to see all of these young men come through, and the ladies of the church served a home-cooked meal every Sunday night for the military people. So, so 1 week I spent at Waikiki Hotel on Waikiki Beach, the Royal Hawaiian Hotel, which was taken over by the submarine force during World War II. And 1 week I spent at the church, just getting soaked up with, with good things from
During this time, did you start doing any informal pastoring and with these guys coming in
Well,
and out, or?
yeah, I did. One thing I did, I felt something I could do, and that is that I would borrow the pastor's car, and I would go down to the beach on a Sunday afternoon, and I would invite servicemen to come to along to the service. And sometimes I would make several trips. I remember the last trip I took, which was after the war was over with. I had invited, and now there's no more danger because the war is over with. So spiritually, it just kind of dried up.
Mm-hmm.
But I saw this officer coming across the park, and I was prompted to go and speak to him. I said, "Sir," I said, "would you be interested in coming to our church for this evening?" I said, "First of all, we have a home-cooked meal, and I said, then we have a service meeting." He looked at me, and the tears began to stream down his face. He said, "That's the most wonderful thing I've heard." Apparently, he had gone through some very bad things. So he came to the church and was very deeply touched.
Mm.
That night, he surrendered his life to Christ. So that was basically my ministry. There were other visitation groups and so on, but I felt comfortable with that, I guess.
I imagine it probably start fueling your fire to do that as a calling too.
Yeah.
I would assume. Yeah.
And not, I couldn't do it when I was in the last part of my service with the commander. But when I was in personnel, I was usually through by 4:30 in the afternoon. And I would go around and talk to my fellow sailors. I would usually just go and I had various ways of opening the conversation.
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't being preachy or anything, just, so I would spend 2-3 hours just going around the barracks. We had 10,000 men, and sometimes I'd fall into a conversation with them for a lengthy period of time. I had a couple of real wonderful buddies. One was a man from Louisiana. His name was Joe Frost. He worked in the post office. And Joe had a brother by the name of Jack Frost. But Joe and I, we hit it off real good. Then I had another friend whose name was Jim Davidson, and he was a Marine. These were very special people to me. So anyway, that's kind of the military.
Okay. Well, let's move now ahead to your post-military life. You've now been discharged. You've married. Continue your story from there.
Yeah. So after our marriage, I've apologized to my wife. I had struck up a friendship with a fellow who worked at a slow mission in Minneapolis, in a very bad part of the city. So he said, "Well, when you get married, why don't you just come live here?" So I went there just with the idea of being a support person. Then the youth director resigned. board came to me and asked me if I would assume that position. Well, I had no training. And then I got invitations to speak at churches to present the work of the mission. And I found myself speaking 2, 3, 4 times a week. I had no, I grew up in a church where we were really taught the Bible. It was a Lutheran church. So I had a working knowledge of the scriptures, but no theological training. So then the director of the mission resigned. So then they came to me and said, would you temporarily take over that position? But God had instilled within me a sense of leadership. When I was in the early days of my military, I was in that office, and I was a leader.
Sure.
I mean, I was just, so leadership has always been and still is a big, interesting part of my life. And that's become instilled in my oldest son, who's 61 years old. He has a whole library of nothing but leadership and management. So I finally said to my wife one day, I said, you know, I need some training. I looked around for Bible college, and I enrolled in St. Paul Bible College. It was the beginning of my education and attended there.
While still running the mission, were you?
Yeah, while I was going there. So then I got kind of crossways with the board because I was doing some things that had never been done before. And we were having craft classes for the kids because the kids were on the street. And I saw a need to get them off the street. So 3 nights a week after school, we had these craft classes. And the board of the mission, they didn't think that was a good thing. I was enlisting students from the college to come and help me. So we had 40, 50, 60 kids after school come in during the cold winter, 20, 30 below zero. We saw to it they had proper clothes. We loved them, cared for them, and so on. So then we took the summer off and went back to my home for the summer. And I worked as a carpenter helper. Then a church in a suburb of Minneapolis, a small church, was looking for a student pastor. So they invited me to come and serve them. And God blessed in a wonderful way. It was a little ingrown group of people. And the city was about 10,000, so I said to myself, it's a shame that we're sitting here with 25, 30 people on Sunday morning when we've got a city of 10,000. And again, I just did something that was out of my, just an inspiration. So I started knocking on doors. Oh, they said, we thought that church was just a Swedish church. I said, no, it's for everybody. So within 90 days, we had moved from 25, 30 people to almost 100. As people started coming, and they, for some reason, liked this young, enthusiastic young man. So I still have no seminary. So then another opportunity came for serving a parish in northern Minnesota. So I wanted to do more. I was too anxious. I should have finished my school, but I didn't. So I went north, and then our denomination, which is Evangelical Covenant Church, realized I had a number of these guys like myself who didn't have completed their bachelor's degree, but who were mature because of the military and so on. So they arranged for us to study during the summer. So I went to summer school and got my seminary training and out of the way. Was ordained in 1957. My seminary days were really wonderful. There's a difference between Bible college and seminary. I was in trouble all the time in Bible college because they were telling us what to believe. And my mind was thinking, there's other views. So when I got to seminary, I discovered that that was okay. So we could argue with the professor, we could debate, we could. So anyway, I served that first parish, which was 3 small churches for 9 years, which is kind of unusual for first time. We divided the parish in one church. Another church came along and said, we want you to come. The local radio station reported one day and said, we've heard of pastor stealing sheep, but he said, we want to tell you about a pastor who stole a church. And this church was independent. And anyway, the Lord blessed in a wonderful way. Because of my makeup, I guess, we drew a lot of people from even 100 miles away who would come for special things. We had to move to the high school auditorium, and at one time we had 1,000 people in a town of 500.
Wow.
But God endowed me with some ability of organization and so on and so forth. So after 9 years, I moved to Kansas. Since then, I've served churches in Kansas, Nebraska, and Colorado, and even served in the position of bishop for a short time. So my life's been very interesting. When I retired at 64, opening came up to do international ministry. So for 15 years I spent traveling, speaking at conferences, ministering to thousands of people.
Wow.
We have seen some amazing things in countries. We've been in 5 African countries, West Africa, East Africa.
Well, you said earlier that you've been, all told, 23 different countries and crossed the Atlantic, but 50 some odd times. And
Yeah. We've been in Indonesia, we've been a lot of the Balkans, in Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia, Albania, Bulgaria, Armenia. It's just amazing, I guess. The man who invited me to come with him was a young man who came to Christ through our ministry and had discipled him, and so he wanted a father figure along. He's an evangelist and I'm a pastor, so it was a good team because we had different gifts and different outlooks on life. So there's so many stories I could tell about. I guess just one story
Sure.
about being in Rwanda. We were there 2 years after the genocide. It was terrible. We stayed in Hotel Rwanda, which had been refurbished. Rwanda is a beautiful country, beautiful country. So we had a week of conference with Christian workers and pastors. Then we scheduled 3 nights, open air meetings. The final night of the meeting, which was Saturday night, we never had meetings on Sunday because we didn't want to interfere with local churches. We were meeting out in the soccer field, and no chairs. People would just stand. There were thousands of people attending the crusade. And one of the things that we would do was just pray for miracles to take place. And we did this before. Well, we would have probably an hour in which the various groups would be singing and worshiping and so on. Anyway, we said to people, my spiritual son said to people, if you have a sickness, just put your hand on your body, and we're going to pray that God will touch you. And Brad, you can't imagine what happened. People started getting healed all over the place. Of all kinds of things. They brought a girl in who was stiff like a steel rod. They lost control, and she fell on the ground and started rolling on the ground. And we had a big rope out in front so that it wouldn't get up to the platform. But I was walking around all along. Suddenly I saw her get up on her knees. And then the next thing I knew, she was trying to get up. She finally got up and stood up. Her mother ran out of the audience, went out there and grabbed a hold of them. Next thing I knew, they were dancing around. This girl had been paralyzed for 11 years. Her mother would take care of her like a baby. So my partner called them up on the platform to tell their story. There were other amazing miracles. People came in walking on crutches and walked out without them. People in these third world countries have a faith that we in America know very little about. Because they don't have doctors. You couldn't even buy an aspirin in Rwanda while you were there. Not even an aspirin. So their only hope is for a supernatural something happen. There's one thing that I never hear about, and that is that, to me, miracles are not an end in themselves. They are a door that opens the heart for God. So my partner calls me up on the platform. They had this, it was terrible, this shaky wooden platform. I mean, he said, come on up, close the service. I got up. So then I realized that there had been no preaching. So I said to the audience, I said, we've seen some powerful things happen here tonight. It's not because we're white or because we are from America. There's one in our midst who we cannot see, and his name is Jesus. I said, he is the one that has touched your blind eyes, who has touched your hearing, who has touched your bodies. Some of you are walking out of here without your crutches. And then I presented the gospel in a very simple way. And I said, for those of you who are not Christians, I invite you to come forward. And I said, I have some words for you. Brad, when they dropped the ropes, it was like hundreds of applicants came. So we had already arranged for our pastors of the city to counsel these people. And we've gotten reports back from those people, many of them not, but enough to know that what happened that night was something that has continued on. But we have seen these kind of things in many, many countries.
Away from the description too of where you've been, you were off the tourist route. You weren't on these nice touristy countries. You were off the beaten path. Yeah.
Right.
War-torn.
Right. We were in Albania during the Kosovo War. That was interesting. We were scheduled to fly into Tirana, and my travel agent called me and said, I'm sorry, I can't get you into Tirana. We had $10,000 worth of medicine, and we could buy medicine at a dime on the dollar. So we had all this medicine and everything ready to go. And so I said to my travel agent, there's got to be a way for you to get us into Tirana. Please do what you can. A couple of hours she called me back. She said, I can fly you into Thessalonica in Greece. And then she said, I don't know how you get from there to, but Greece is on the border
Right.
of Albania.
Right.
So I said, book us. So we flew into Thessalonica with all this medicine, boxes. And then we went out looking for the biggest taxi cab we could find to take us to the border. And at the border there was a hotel. So we stayed overnight there, and then we got a hold of a Albanian taxi cab, old Mercedes-Benz. The wheel bearings on it were shot. I wondered, it was a miracle we got to the city. We only had a name of somebody in Toronto. We had no hotel reservation. Driver says, you'll find a room, and if you do, it's $250 a night. No, that's God is an amazing God. So we said to the taxi cab driver, we have this name. So he said, well, I know a lady that used to work for the American consulate. So he said, I'll go to her. Maybe she can help us. You talk about God's divine direction. So she came out and talked to us. She said, who are you looking for? And we mentioned this lady's name, and she said, she's my best friend. She lives just over there.
Yeah.
So we went over and had a long visit with this lady. And then we said to the driver, well, we got to find a place to stay. He said, well, I don't know. Well, I said, let's just drive around the city. So we went down the street, and I saw a little sign. It wasn't about that big. Hotel. I said, oh, stop. So I went in the hotel and said, yeah, I have one room left. I said, how much are you going to charge me? He said, $25 a night. It was just two small bunks in the bathroom. Well, that's all we needed.
Yeah.
So we spent a week in going from refugee camp to refugee camp. And I've been in a lot of refugee camps.
Wow.
I've been in contact with a lot of Muslims.
Well, we could probably sit down and do a whole tape just on your experiences there. Yeah.
One of the things that I learned about the Muslims is that they don't care even about their own people. It's really sad. I could tell you story. But again, we've had miracles amongst the Muslims. And when they see a miracle, then they listen to us Christians. But the miracles are a door, a window that open up the hearts of people. Anyway, so now the last 2 years I developed Parkinson's and some other things, and I'm not able to travel anymore. But I keep contact with these people through email, which is wonderful.
Yeah.
Many,
Well, Pastor Johnson, as we finish off this interview, is there any sort of closing statement or thought that you would like to wrap this all up with, that you would like to end this interview with, or maybe not?
I just want to give praise to God for enriching my life, giving me a wonderful wife, 6 children, and 8 grandchildren, 8 great-grandchildren. And we live not in a plush situation, but we are living a comfortable place. So God has taken care of us, and I thank God for His blessing upon us. And now during these retirement years, I have time to pursue some theological questions which I have wrestled with for a long time. I have a retired pastor that he and I get together almost every other day. But as I look over my life, I am amazed. Not that I have done anything great, but it's been amazing to me of my opportunities to serve, to mentor young pastors. When I was filling in as the interim superintendent or bishop, I had the privilege of leadership of many situations. As I said earlier, leadership is really, to me, is something that is so needed in the church, and it's needed in daily life, and certainly in our nation. I hurt when I see leadership, supposedly people who make such stupid mistakes. They are not acquainted with protocol or with how the human mind and things function. So I could go on and on, but I just want to say thanks to God. Rescuing my life out of alcoholism and changing my attitude and my spirit. I hated the Japanese before I had the spiritual experience, but afterwards I remember going to a Japanese church in Hawaii. My heart just loved those people. I mean, that's God. Changes from hatred a lot. So, thank you, Brad, for this time.
Well, I want to thank you for sitting down and telling a fascinating story, and more importantly, I want to thank you as well for your service to our country.
Thank you. Oh, this picture of myself was taken in Hawaii. I don't know when, but it was while I still was in my uniform. This is a picture of Loyd Johnson. He was stationed at Hickam Field, which is right next to Pearl Harbor, and he's the one that came over and introduced me to another young man who was from our community at the submarine base. This is a picture of the three of us together, a young man by the name of Olson. He was one of our neighbors back home. And so the three of us caught a plane ride to Hilo, spent a Sunday over there, and that's where this picture was taken. And my friend Ray was able to send this picture home, and it was published in our local paper in Paynesville.
Now, where are you in this picture?
I am on the right-hand side.
Right-hand side, and then Ray's in the middle?
Ray and then Olson, Ivan Olson. What's the name of that young man?